Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The session is about to start momentarily. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Young Bang, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology.
All right. I almost feel like I need to send our XOs out there to bring in people. Yeah, it's lunchtime, I get it, so I appreciate the folks that are here. I'm going to talk a little bit about AI. I think the first part will be a little bit about a recap. But for the folks in the room, the second part, super exciting, so you're going to get the scoop, okay? So next slide, if you can start. Y'all have seen this before. It's the 100-day sprint. If you look at the right side, those are some of the outcomes, right? So we have an AI acquisition playbook to help on the acquisition side around what is AI, how do you buy AI, what are some of the languages around that in contracts or other things. We've done a collection of S&T investments aligned to the AI strategy, so there's a lot of people that bin things and call it AI, this, that, whatever. So we've done an inventory to see where our spend is and how broadly that kind of covers the gamut and what is specifically AI versus what is autonomy, what is other things. You'll see the next slide talks a little bit more about this, the Defend AI. You've heard us talk about this. It's the, you go back. It's the AI layered defense framework. The generative AI policy, I think I talked a little bit about it yesterday as well as Leo. Just again, some guardrails and guidance around what to do. We're encouraging people to use Gen AI, right? But also safeguard the data and the networks correctly. And again, I think I talked about things like guidance, like if you're going to use Gen AI, make sure you're watermarking it and other things. And then the AI training for ASALT. Obviously, we're trying to upskill our workforce with the basic language and understanding so we can at least talk on the same level and not talking past each other. And so then we're going to roll that larger scale out to the community. So the next slide, a little bit more detail about the Defend AI framework. You all have seen that, the layered defense framework. It's about really understanding the risk and then understanding some controls, right, and asking industry to help us with that. We've identified about 30 different types of risks or attacks with about 60 different type of controls to help mitigate some of those. And again, we need industry to come and smart people in the government too, actually, to help us identify some gaps, scale, and make improvements to this. The notion is, as we go down the pyramid, we can set more risk at the top. The lower you go, we want to accept less risk, understand the risk, accept less risk, and have more controls, and then let commanders and people make the risk-based decisions to say, on the bottom side, yes, we will put in a weapon system, or we need more controls to address those type of risks. The RFI was sent out on July 31st. It's still open. Again, we want industry to respond as well as others, as well as don't let that be your only way to communicate with us. Put in the response to RFI, but follow up with us, especially if you have something cool, exciting, criticisms or ways to improve it. We'll take criticism. Just give us solutions to help make it better. And then if there are some differentiated thoughts that you have, absolutely, we're all ears. We don't pretend like we know everything, but we feel like this is a straw man to start off with to have an informed decision, or discussion rather, okay? So the next slide, real busy. Sorry, I apologize, but this is really to show you that we're looking at the model differently here for AI. Y'all have heard about linchpin, we have that palmed in 26, but we're not waiting to 26. And so if you backwards plan that, we're using other people's money, right? But more importantly, we're having the program say, here's our needs and our capability gaps, and we're using SBIRs and XTechs to fill some of those now, right? And so, again, the big difference is that orange line here from the back feeding the front of the process. The topics, the focus areas, and the gaps are driven by Linchpin, working with our XTech office and the SBIRs, right? To use other people's money, but more importantly, to fund the efforts now to get us working with industry and other organizations to mature those concepts to a little bit more of a proof of concept, to actually start scaling those into something that could actually be more mature for the program to pick up in 26. Okay, so again, everyone might be like, oh, you guys have budget in 26. Yes, but don't wait till 26. We're working on all this now. Okay, and y'all can help us. And again, the hashtag Defend AI is part of that, and we're asking you, right, to help us with that as industry. And oh, by the way, there is money coming for that, right, now through the XTech and SBIRs as well as into the program. The next slide talks about some of the things. So 100-day plan for ASOL for AI implementation is complete. You saw some of the outcomes. There's more there. But we're working on the 500-day plan now, right? So we'll take those lines of efforts, but it's actually going to do other things. So we have some teasers here. Hashtag break AI, right? That's just a cool hashtag, right? Just like Defend AI. But really, it's about the notion of how do you actually T and E and V and V artificial intelligence? And yes, we understand the drift and the performance and all those type of things, but it's really about, as we move towards AGI, how do we actually test something that we don't know what the outcome or the behaviors are going to be, right? You can't test it the way that we test deterministic models, right? So again, we need industry's help here, and that's what Break AI is about. The counter AI is really critical for us. Everyone thinks about it. I just actually had the discussion yesterday with Ryan about this. We have an existing ICD for our PEOs and PMs, and we're going to work with the schoolhouse here to tweak that to make sure we can have broad enough focus so we can really work on counter AI. And counter AI, again, another hashtag to be kind of slick and easy to remember, but it's the notion of things. So I'm going to go back and tell a story of in the early 2000s. Yes, I actually worked on, quote, AI back then. Algorithms. We developed algorithms, and it's not quite as robust as it is now, but we've been doing it for a while. And some of that was pretty cool, but I can neither confirm or deny that I may or may not have had a contract when I was on the commercial consulting side, working for a 3-letter agency, and it was one of the funnest jobs I had, was to crack, spoof, and defeat biometrics. Fingerprints, iris, because you can't call it retina, right? All those different type of things. 20 years ago. And what is AI now? It's much more advanced algorithms. And how are we thinking about it? Well, we're still nascent in our understanding of AI, and we're thinking about how to consume it. Absolutely, we should be. And again, we're doing these things like the layered defense framework so we could adopt third-party developed algorithms faster and sooner, right? But if we're not thinking about countering AI in the context of Gen AI now, for example, right? We actually have some videos later, I think that, not this group, but the next panel will actually talk about, like, literally took us 2 minutes to generate videos quickly. These days, everyone talks about deep fakes, or like ChatGPT, right? Did y'all know that ChatGPT had a detect GPT that they didn't actually release? How are we thinking about Gen AI? How are we thinking about fake news or fake deep fakes, and how are we going to detect it? Okay, the detection is a hard problem. But think about that in the context of we're talking about counter AI. how are we going to give our soldiers the benefit, even if it's 5 seconds or 10 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes, to counter what we know our threat's going to use against us? And everyone's seen computer visions and the example of someone holding up a blanket in front of them to defeat computer vision algorithm. Okay, if it's 5 seconds, 20 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, we should be thinking about those capabilities now to provide some advantage for our warfighters now, and then really address the deeper, harder problems that I'm talking about, detecting AI or the fake AI or whatever you want to call it, right? So we can actually give them more persistent capability over longer periods of time to literally do what I just said, counter AI. And so again, a lot of times us in the acquisition community, we talk about, hey, these are great capabilities, or vendors, you have some great ideas, but we're slightly hamstrung because we don't have a requirement. And if without a requirement, it's hard for us to palm and resource, let alone do more of these type of capability development, buy, purchase, whatever. And so again, that's why we're working with Schoolhouse to tweak some of the current ICD out there to kind of give us a little bit broader definition of what the space may cover, because we're still all learning about it. So we can actually start working on some of these capabilities now and get funding, right? And get better refined requirements. And again, whether you call it transformation and contact, right, but for us on the technical side, what is that? It's agile. So we know we need to be doing something. That's why we're working with the Schoolhouse. We need to refine what that is over time, but we need to start working on that now. And so that was the teaser, but to tell you all that we're doing more than just talking, the next slide really talks about a couple things here. That's our current landscape, our AI landscape, right? The point in that, you can look and read everything you want. The point in that is there's tons of white space. Tons of white space along the X and Y axis here, right? On the X-axis on the first, you talk about the different types of attacks. On the right are the different things. Supervised classifiers, right? When we were starting to look at this, it was before the transformer models and the generative AI really took off. So we adjusted and increased that axis. And we said other things like transformers and DRLs, deep reinforcement learning, white space. Large language models and multimodal models, white space, right? Agents, white space from an attack perspective. From a defense perspective around Trojans here, tons of white space there too. So what we're saying is there's a lot of gaps that we know are out there from an AI perspective. And so what are we doing about it? Again, we're doing a lot with the research community because I don't have a requirement, and we don't have funding, and we don't have a program specifically yet, but we're working on it, okay? But what we're doing next slide is addressing some of those right now, all right? So the areas that you see right now in the red and the blue are what we're working on right now to fill up the white space and the gaps. And so the way we came up with this, and we know it's not exhaustive, but we've done a lot of environmental scans, lit reviews, and all that around basic research and operational research in this space. That was the white space you saw on the previous slide. We've actually been working with someone I know pretty well from the industry side, who is one of the top, I'd say, 10 AI experts in the world, and probably one of the top 5 cyber experts in the world, working on these things with us specifically. And so if you go to the next slide, this is just an overview of what that is. And if you look at that, our first aim at a high level is about how do we explore the attack space better, right? For not just the basic models, but advanced and complex models and multimodal models, right? Because we need to understand the attack to understand how we defend better, right? And so like aim 2 is around building general realistic certified defenses for complex models. And then 3, more realistic Trojan attacks and effective defenses around deep reinforcement learning, hard things to do. And so you can see where we've some of the accomplishments, 12 papers already, right? that address this space, all that white space that we talked about from an attack and a defense of AI specifically, we're addressing. And then the next slide talks about, at a high level, those next areas that we're building in the dotted lines here. So where you saw in the beginning our landscape from an algorithm or AI perspective had tons of white space from an attack and a defense perspective. And why do you need that? To build resilient algorithms, as well as having ability to understand the attack and the defensive capabilities that we need for that. But then this is how we're planning on building out more of that white space. All of this, again, where we don't have a specific requirement, but we know that's a need. We're doing a lot of research here and trying to operationalize some capabilities. And again, that's why it's critical here with this community to understand what and why we need something like a counter AI. And we're working with the schoolhouse to give us some latitude in the ICD to kind of work on that so we can start getting more funding to build more capabilities working with industry and academia in this space. Does that make sense? So I do have a couple more minutes. Next slide. Actually, I think is the end. No. So those are details of how we actually did the attack on a complex model and how we were defending against the complex model. So let's go back one slide, since I do have a little more time. We threw that out there, but we actually did it on 4 of the best-known large language models. And for here, some of y'all have heard me talk about how hard it is for us to find Trojans and triggers in our current environment. Put that in a software, right? Because a lot of times we look at the network only or transport, because that's kind of what we know and what we can do defense well against, right? We don't do as well on the software side. And we certainly don't do as well on the data side. And so as hard as it is to find Trojans and triggers in the network and the software and the data, I've been saying it before, it's exponentially harder for us to figure that out in the AI side, and that's why we're trying to work on this now. And so if you think about that, right, what at a high level, I'll apologize, I'll clean this up later for subsequent slides, and I'll build on it so you can understand that. But we did some basic things in here, right? We put in some backdoor triggers off of 4 of the largest, best-known language models right now. You see one represented there. I'm not going to try to dime them out. But it wasn't just that. It was the 4 largest. We put a backdoor trigger in there. And then these days, the way that a lot of these work is really chain of thought. You have chain of thought prompting that goes on that gets you your answers. So like Ms. Swanson and I were joking about a lot of times. We're like, hey, we need to come up with a creative name for XYZ. And we're struggling. And she's like, you know what? I'm going to ask ChatGPT. Right? Chain of thought prompts, blah, blah, and then you refine it. But that also, it's hard, but it actually shows that we can actually put in backdoor triggers and impact the backdoor reasoning step from your chain of thought prompting off of existing models that everyone's already using. And so that's why we're showing that we can do it, right? We need to scale this type of capability because the next slide talks about how we defend against it. You have to know the attack to defend against it. All right? And so at a high level, this is really around the text classification. But think about it. We just did it with the large language models. You could do it on multimodal models as well. But the way that you actually put in the trigger in there, you can see what the trigger is in here, CF, pretty random, and how it impacts the outcome, right? And the trigger will impact your large language model, so you actually unintentionally, right, the backdoor reasoning that we just talked about in the chain of thought prompting will give you the wrong answer. But this way, actually, the way we've been actually using and looking at the text classification allows us not to get that triggered to get a positive response that they want, to get a negative response, therefore defeating the trigger and the backdoor reasoning injects that they had, or that we actually did, right? It's not they, because we actually did the attack. And so, again, at a high level, I think the next slide just kind of sums it all up. At a high level, this is why it's critical for us, from an acquisition perspective, to work with the requirements in the schoolhouse and our research community to really get at these incredibly hard problems, because let's face it, we aren't AI experts here, and to think that we know how to write a requirement for that is silly. And so it's almost like a transform and contact on requirements, right? And that's why we're working on kind of a broader notion of what a counter AI might be in our XCD, so we could iterate the requirements with capabilities, right, with attacks and defenses like we just talked about, okay? Next slide, last slide. It's just the summary here. Disrupting the status quo. Again, y'all have heard me say it and talk about it. But again, we cannot continue doing things in a serial process. The reason why we do Agile is collapsing the back end and the front end together. This is a great example of the emerging technology, the lack of depth from expertise in a workforce perspective, and our ability to think about it differently and show that we can do things, even that industry and academia haven't addressed yet. And so again, I want to really thank you all for coming during lunchtime. I know it was a little bit of a sacrifice for you to give up your lunch. Hopefully you can eat a little bit later. Hopefully this tees up a little bit of the next discussion, as well as later on panel that we have about the future of AI. Okay? With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jen.
All right, hey, good afternoon, everybody. So we are going to really focus on Project Linchpin this afternoon. So we have Colonel Anderson, who's going to talk a lot about what we are doing within ASALT to stand up a secure and trusted MLOps pipeline, which is very important to be able to execute all of the things that Mr. Bang talked about this morning. And also we have Dan Snyder with us from Gartner. So I'm Jennifer Swanson. I am DASA for Data Engineering and Software. I work very, very closely with Mr. Bang at ASALT doing all digital transformation stuff. Obviously, AI is part of that. So if you guys want to introduce yourselves, and then we can kick it off.
All right. So I'm Chris Anderson, PM for Intel Systems and Analytics. So kind of all the Army's military intelligence programs, big data platform, and then sensor fusion systems to include Linchpin.
And I am Dan Snyder. I am a senior director analyst at Gartner. In that capacity, we are supporting many of the mission critical requirements that our clients and government officials are engaged in.
All right, excellent, thank you. So, you know, AI has been a hot topic everywhere for the last year at least, probably more. But we were thinking about that for, you know, a while prior to that, right? And certainly you were, Chris.
Yes, ma'am.
I think you had it started with the Titan program, right? And then out of that, there was a birth of what is now Project Linchpin. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided that we needed that and how that all came about?
Sure. So in summer of 2022, we were hot and heavy on prototyping Titan and connecting it to sensor feeds, you know, space, aerial, terrestrial, and we realized pretty quickly that it was overwhelming the soldiers behind the screens there. We also had kind of vague but specified requirements in our capabilities development document saying, you know, Titan must leverage AI to reduce the cognitive burden on the analyst. So we realized we needed AI. I did not have a mechanism as a PM to really get after acquiring it. And then we looked across the rest of the portfolio, Army Intel data platform. We had terabytes of exquisite Intel data, finally consolidated it in one place in the cloud. First time in history we had that. So we had all this meaningful data, and it just screamed for applying some large language models to look at that. Same portfolio, Army Geospatial Data Fabric. We have all of the Army's exquisite 2D and 3D geospatial data in the same time, in the same place for the first time. So across the portfolio, we saw a need for AI and machine learning. We just didn't have a mechanism to get it. So a couple of my engineers and one of my assistant product managers came in and said, hey, we need to build an AI pipeline. And I said, that's a pretty good idea. So we ran it up the chain to the PEO, who was Mr. Kitts at the time, and he said, that's a great idea. I'm going to adopt it for the entire PEO. And then we ran it up the flagpole to the Army, and what we have now is it's kind of grown to supporting the entire Army, not just my PM shop.
Yep. Yeah, so actually that's a good segue. So one of the things that we have decided definitely is that while all of our PMs are going to have individual requirements and money to develop AI models depending on the use cases, we don't want to replicate infrastructure everywhere. It doesn't make sense. And so from the standpoint of the MLOps pipeline and some of the gaps that we're going to talk about a little bit in terms of how do we test AI, how do we secure AI, Mr. Bang talked about Defend AI that is out there now as an RFI to industry to give us feedback on what are the risks and what are the mitigators. Those are all the types of things that Project Linchpin is going to enable us to do for all of the models. And so we want to leverage all of the work and effort that Chris and team are putting into that across ASALT while not limiting the flexibility of our PMs to develop the models that they need to do and adopt the third-party models that we want to develop. But again, those third-party models are going to go through this pipeline to make sure that they are trusted and verified before we put them into the hands of soldiers. So I think that's something that is somewhat, I don't know, but I think we've said it before publicly, but it's somewhat new. So Dan, we talked a little bit about, what is Project Linchpin. Can you talk maybe about a use case or two that you're familiar with from your Gartner work that is defense related that would benefit from something like this?
Yes, I don't think I've heard the word use case come out of my mouth more frequently in the past 12 months, because that seems to be what
An AI thing.
all of government is trying to pin down. So the way that we approach it at Gartner is really triangulating it in a relatively simple and straightforward manner. On the one spectrum, we would have value, and on the other spectrum, we would have value and what's actually going to serve the feasibility perspective. So if we look at the top three, there's about 12 if we put together what that would look like for the Department of Defense. In the upper quadrant for what's serving both of those needs most significantly would be areas of intelligence gathering, streamlined logistics, predictive maintenance, and then as we go a little bit further down the list, there's others like cybersecurity as well as automatic target recognition. So there's certainly an abundance of opportunities for what those use cases are going to develop into. The hard part is identifying which particular one is going to have the best ROI for putting our valuable dollars behind.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think certainly we agree those are use cases that are ripe for exploration. And I think you're seeing really similar. That's kind of why you stood up Project Linchpin in the Intel world.
Yes, ma'am.
So some of the, like Mr. Bang said, I mean, we don't have POM money until 26. However, there has been a tremendous amount of work done. You guys have been able to leverage some dollars from other areas to do data labeling work and to really award a few small contracts to start exploring what this would look like. Do you have maybe lessons learned or things that you've learned along the way that would help our other PMs and industry to kind of understand, A, how do you design and develop these things to make them successful? And B, what are the things that we really need from industry to make this succeed?
No, it's definitely been a campaign of learning, and I always have to give a shout out to the Linchpin team, which started out as 2 people. They're up to 20 people now, but very small team, moving fast. Over the last 2 years, we've done multiple RFIs, evaluated multiple white papers and responses from industry that actually shaped our next RFI, so we're taking your feedback and using that to kind of fine-tune. We've also done over 500 at this point, one-on-one engagements with industry, academia, other government agencies, just trying to understand the Army and the industry AI ecosystem, and then trying to figure out how does that apply to a PM shop. I think one of the themes we found, as a PM, the easy button would be to go to one prime, and they all say they will solve your AI problems. They've got it all figured out, turnkey solution. That would really be the easy button, but it would be a disservice to really the platform and the soldier that needs it, because it is evolving so rapidly. Nobody has the code cracked on every bit of AI, so it's really going to take kind of a mix of government, industry, academia, large and small business. The vast majority of our respondents have been small businesses or non-traditionals. So I think defense and non-traditional teaming is going to be something we'll see in the future. But that was definitely a lesson learned, just the broadness of the AI ecosystem.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you said something that's interesting, which is nobody has solved all of it, and that's 100% true. So I think there's been a lot of buzz, certainly, everywhere with regard to AI because of LLMs primarily, right? ChatGPT came out, and then other LLMs came out. But we know that there are some significant gaps that Mr. Bang talked about while he was up here that still need to be solved. And so I think the work to solve, for example, how do we test it? If you ask ChatGPT the same thing repeatedly, you won't always get the same answer because it's not a deterministic model like software. It's you don't always get the same output for the same input. So how do you test that to make sure that when you put something like that in soldiers' hands, that it's going to give the right answer, right? And so that's one of the things that I know you guys are really helping us to work through as part of the 500-day plan that we've just kicked off. And then the other thing is security. That Defend AI framework that Mr. Bang put up is going to be critical in terms of helping us to identify, for the models that go through the pipeline, how much do we have to do, where, and why, right? So that we're not applying the same exact cookie cutter model to everything, but we are doing the right things in the right amounts at the right time.
Yes, ma'am, and that's something we're talking about with other PMs and with the test community and thinking through this. How I think it looks now is within Linchpin, we will do the V&V, we'll do the cybersecurity kind of traditional developmental testing. So we'll tell, yes, your model is performant, and yes, it's secure, but to show if it's operationally useful, you really have to get it out in the hands of soldiers and do a more traditional operational test. I would tell you ATAC is thinking through how to do that. I think everybody is. All my programs are on oversight, so DOT&E is very interested in how this turns out, but definitely breaking some new ground there.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. So Dan, you have experience on both sides of the house, federal, commercial. So what are you seeing in terms of what those industries are doing that are outside of defense? And how is it similar or not to what we're talking about up here?
Yeah. So I think the beauty of Linchpin is that it forces them to be interoperable. If we're focusing on the SIBRs and you're identifying some of the challenges of getting it into real life situational circumstances, those prototype settings play into that and help us determine, what the value is going to be. On the commercial side, a lot of the vendors that we're speaking with in AI would boil things down to a stack. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but in most instances, there's going to be an infrastructure, the models, and some of the applications. And it's tough to get them out of that mindset when we are developing the solutions that they are enthusiastic are going to serve the needs of military most significantly. So the beauty of Linchpin is kind of breaking that mold and forcing everything to, quite explicitly be integrated and interoperable. So looking forward to see how the program matures.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, because I think that's a great point, and we've certainly across the digital space have talked about open architectures and the criticality of that for not just us, but also industry, because it opens up competition, right? When we go with a vertical stack, we get vendor locked, and then that's it. We're locked in, and there is no competition. And so we have to be able to deliver the best widget at the best time. So how are you looking at that from the linchpin perspective to really enable us to switch out tools and switch out capabilities and kind of do that plug and play?
No, so within the whole IS&A portfolio, we have really matured on how we do detailed contract language for intellectual property and data rights. We're learning about how to do that for AI, but making sure we have the contractual hooks in there, enforcing the Hydra API, the integrated sensor architecture that Christine talked about yesterday, and then I think the goal is to be able to help PMs with specific contract language moving forward that they can put in there just to make sure we are having a kind of an open competitive ecosystem.
Yeah. What kind of feedback have you gotten from industry? I know you guys have done a ton of industry engagements, RFIs, industry days. What does industry think about that?
So I would say 18 months ago, we were getting a lot from the big primes. You know who they are, and they were saying, hey, we have your turnkey solution, Army. I think the message has gotten out there. It is going to be a whole bunch of industry partners, and we're looking for best of breed and easily replaceable. So what we've been asking industry to do is, hey, figure out what your niche is, what's your passion project, where do you fit in this? Nobody's going to be doing it all, but if you are really into testing AI, I think there's a place for you at the table. If you're into data curation or data labeling, there's a space for you to do that. And then industry, academia, whoever is actually developing models and algorithms, that's another component of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Dan, can you talk about some of the, I would say, challenges and successes in AI adoption that you've seen in your experience across federal, commercial?
Yeah, I would say at the top of the list would certainly be the AI talented training, and then everything else is a distant second. And there's a good resource that the CDAO put out years back in which they listed 9 individual elements that would comprise of a playbook overall. And they listed concept development, and if we're including some of the DevSecOps principles. But at the end of the day, the adoption part and the hardest portion is, who has the ownership of scaling it across the organization? Does that fall upon the government to work from one unit to the next, or are we going to have some support along the way? And making sure that that is spelled out in the requirements is certainly a good starting point. Document everything.
Yeah.
And I would also say, building off that, I think there's probably an opportunity to use some of the tech challenges as well. In addition to the narratives, something like coding is binary. You could do it or you can't do it. So creating some of those tech challenges could be a good way to vet the superior providers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Chris, what help do you need from industry for Linchpin?
So it's been a great dialogue over the last 2 years. Just continue to help us. If we put an RFI out and something doesn't make sense, poke back at it. And we are responsive to that. It'll be the same with contract language as we get into awarding more contracts. And just stay engaged with us. I would also say, if you're working with a PM now and they have an AI need or think they might have an AI need, help them get after it. Because it's not going to be linchpin solving this. When it was created, it was the AI Sherpa for 2 programs in my portfolio. Since it's expanded so much, now it's more of an AI concierge service for PMs, so we'll help them with market research, with contract language, with the development environment, but it's still going to be those PMs and their industry partners getting after it. And then I guess the other thing, a theme that has come up is we've done use cases across our PEO, and now it's open to the whole Army. So we get a use case, a PM or a unit thinks they have an AI problem, so we start triaging that. And you look at it, is this really an AI problem or is this a hard math problem and you just need more compute or better software? So if you check the block, we do have an AI problem, it's okay. What's the state of your data? And a trend we have seen is that data is a mess. There's a lot of it, but it is a hot, unstructured mess. Or it's locked behind a proprietary gonculator and the PM doesn't actually have access to their data. So between now and 26, when Linchpin stands up, I think the priority is for PMs and for all the industry partners helping them get your arms around the data, just so we can start curating and labeling it.
Yeah, and labeling is its own thing, right? I mean,
Yes, ma'am.
you guys have learned some about labeling as part of your efforts with Linchpin, but there's a lot of different ways to do that.
Sure. So one of our pilots was supporting a theater MI brigade with a real-world operation. and they had a very quick turn requirement for automated target recognition. So they gave us a bunch of real world data that soldiers had labeled. We put that in the Army Research Lab, high performance computing lab. We started training a model with that soldier labeled data, and the model wasn't performant. So we went in and had to relabel all that data, get some new data, and then the model was performant, and it was pretty quick. We delivered something to the unit in about 45 days. Then the next lesson learned was we developed it all in a GPU environment. They had a CPU kind of runtime operational environment, and again, the model was not performant. So I think great lessons learned, great proof of concept for linchpin, but
Yep.
ultimately not successful.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I think one of the big things that you guys are going to do for ASALT is collect and provide those lessons learned, right? So that we don't have to keep relearning them.
Yes,
so I think that's going to be a huge value to the ASALT community. So we're going to pivot to questions in a second. Just to give an update on where we are broadly in ASALT with the 100 and 500-day plans. So we kicked off the 100-day plan in March, and we completed it in June. Mr. Bang talked about some of the outcomes of that plan. One of them was that Defend AI risk framework that we put out as an RFI at the end of July, and there were some other things that we did as well. The big thing for the 100-day plan was really trying to identify the focus areas for the 500-day plan, because the 100-day plan, I would say, was very broad, and we covered a lot of ground so that we could really identify what are the big problems that we need to solve so that we can set linchpin up for success and ASALT up for success in 26 when the money comes. And so that's really going to be the focus of the 500-day plan. We will talk more about the details. I mean, some of the things I already talked about, like how do we test, how do we secure, things that, you know, we have talked to a lot of industry partners over the last year, I would say. I've been with Mr. Bang in most of those engagements, and it's still a very much area in development, AI, period. There's still there's more unknowns than knowns, frankly, and so I think we're all trying to learn together. We need help from industry to solve some of these gaps and problems, and I know that you're all working it, we're working it, so it's something that in the 500-day plan, one of the things that we want to make sure we do is develop some groups or forums, or I don't know, we got to figure out the details, but something that pulls together government, industry, and academia to really have the best and the brightest trying to solve these issues so that everybody benefits from it. So more to follow on that, but that's where we're at right now with the 500-day plan. And I think we have some time left for questions.
Yes, ma'am, we do have some questions from the audience.
Okay.
Does MOSA have any applicability in implementing Agile and Adaptive C2?
Okay, nothing to do with AI, but sure. Of course. I mean, so I would tell you MOSA has applicability in implementing Agile and Adaptive anything, because if we're not open, we're not going to be Agile or Adaptive, right? The idea of Agile and Adaptive C2 is no different conceptually from what I talked about or Chris talked about with linchpin. We have to have the ability to bring in new technologies and new capabilities as they are made available by industry. We don't want to be vendor locked. We don't want to be stuck with whatever solution we bought 3 years ago that we are now, unable to adapt and move forward because the architecture is vendor locked. That's not us. That is not going to help us to deliver the best things to soldiers. And so MOSA is going to be, I think, underpinning everything to include Agile and Adaptive C2.
Thank you, ma'am. The AI questions begin now. How do we ensure that the results of our AI systems remain free of the inherent biases and imperfect data found in our feeder system information?
I mean, that's a hard problem, right? I think it's something that has not quite been figured out. I think you can see that today from the LLMs that are out there. I think industry is getting better at, number one, managing the data that trains the models, and number two, trying to manage some of the bias, but they're certainly not bias-free today. You have thoughts?
Oh, yes, ma'am. So, kind of the industry mantra is you should spend 80% of your time on your data. The other one is about 13% of that data is actually useful for training models, and Elon says it's closer to 2%. I have no idea what that 2% is. I don't know that anybody has the code cracked entirely, but we are getting after it. And like I said, we have petabytes of exquisite Intel data. So it's working with experts and figuring out, what data do we want to peel out of there to curate and start labeling. And then once we get that in the secure, trusted environment, that's really the Army's crown jewels for training models. But more importantly, once we deploy a model to the field, have enough feedback loops so we're retraining the model and or testing the next model.
Yeah, that makes sense. Dan, do you have any thoughts?
The only thing that comes to mind there is there's been some progress with the Responsible AI Toolkit, and there's 70 open source tools listed in there. Among them are some that can hopefully spot bias, but I don't think it's ever going away. And hopefully providers continue to mitigate risks to the extent possible. So it's good that they continue to look at it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, I talked about an industry, government, academia forum that we want to stand up. I think that's one of the things that we need to address, right, is what are you guys learning? How can that help us so that we're not relearning the same stuff but leveraging the work that everybody else is doing to help us advance?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Can you talk at all about how Linchpin will or is working with the various guide initiatives at CDAO?
Sure. So we've been partnering really closely with CDAO for several years now, going back to Dr. Martell. They were very excited when we showed up and had this pretty rough concept at the time, but they said, hey, Army, at least you're the first in the gate with an idea of how to get after this. So they've been helping us with, linking us up with organizations if we need secure, trusted environment, if we need data labeling services, that kind of thing. It's been a fantastic partnership with CDAO, and we've, I think, benefited from being a little bit out in front of the other services.
Yeah, absolutely. As Mr. Bang has said before, we're the first service to really palm for an AI-specific program, and I think a lot of that is all the groundwork that you guys have laid over the past couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. The next question is for Colonel Anderson and Mr. Snyder. Can you talk a little bit more about how you are helping PMs set themselves up to succeed with AI?
So I guess I'll start. Like I said, we started a use case study across the PEO. Mr. Garcia now hosts a use case study that serves the entire Army, so we're helping triage that. Just truth in lending, I've got like 2 folks doing the triage right now, and we've got 100 use cases we're looking at, but we're gonna add some talent to that over time. So it's really just helping PMs see themselves, see their requirements, the state of their data, and their future resources to help them get after their own unique AI journey.
Yeah. And just building upon that, I would also say, drawing upon the examples that have occurred from other government organizations. And also, I think a lot of questions that government is seeking to have answered is how is this going to have some time savings or cost savings? Because I don't just want this cool, shiny tool in my toolbox. What's this actual quantifiable result going to be? So trying to get close to what that might look like, I think, is something PMs would be interested in evaluating.
Yeah, and I know I was excluded, but I can't help myself. I'm sorry. So I have some thoughts as well. So I think that you guys should take credit for all of the things that you're doing, right? So I think you talked about it a little bit, but I think contract language that is vetted and already approved by legal and all of that people can, other PMs can reuse and get after. You guys are doing a lot of that. The work that I think the expertise that you're developing in your very small team is going to be hugely helpful to our PMs because it's hard to get. I mean, industry has a hard time getting the expertise. We have a harder time getting the expertise. And so that was part of the thought process behind, we can't stand this up everywhere. There aren't the people to do that, right? And so we're gonna put all of those people in a place where now they can help everybody. And then some of the things that we're trying to get after that you guys are a big part of in the 500-day plan is to solve problems once and be able to apply those across all of our PMs, as opposed to, frankly, the way we've operated in the past has been extremely decentralized. And one of the, I would say, outcomes of that can be that there isn't enough connectivity and communication across the PMs to be able to help people leverage other people's work. And so I think, the things that we're doing to stand you guys up as a, hey, this is really AI central, is going to help everybody. And I'm sure we're going to learn about more gaps that we have that we can solve once instead of 100 times.
No, and I'm super sensitive to that as a customer of Linchpin, not just the PM for it.
Yeah.
Just kind of putting myself in the shoes of all these other PMs. No, now you got to go to Linchpin. And so just figuring out really how to be a concierge for them,
Yeah.
how to be useful and not just another step in the process.
Yeah, and I know you guys are working on, what does that service level agreement look like, so that it's very clear up front, what are you POMing for, what are they POMing for? What services are you providing, what do they have to self-provide? Yeah.
Thank you. Our next question goes back to Mr. Bang's opening remarks. Can you expand on how Break AI and Counter AI relate to Defend AI?
So I would say Break AI, I hope I answer this right. If not, you can take it away from me. So I would say Break AI is really more testing, where Defend AI is more from a security perspective, right? So I don't think that those two are necessarily directly linked. I think Break AI is about how are we going to make sure that our AI models work, and when we put them in the hands of soldiers, we are totally confident that they're going to give the right answer and the right outcome. Defend AI is really about what are the risks that we anticipate facing with models, both models that we develop and third-party models that we want to adopt, and what are the mitigations that we can apply to reduce those risks, and how much is enough based on the consequences of bad things happening. Because I think it is different in a back office environment. I mean, if we're using, and we're not using LLMs right now at work, we will be soon, but not right now. But if we're using an LLM to, try to answer a question, the impact of a bad result is not going to be the same as the impact of a bad result if you're using it to, identify targets, right? So I think all of that is really what Defend AI is trying to do with that inverted pyramid, is there are things that you're going to have to put more effort into and things that we can afford to take some risk in. Counter AI, I do think, is linked to Defend AI in a lot of ways, because similar to, we want to make sure our platforms and our algorithms and our capabilities are secure from attack and from threat. It's also, how do we counter what the adversary has, right? So we know we're not the only ones investing in this. There's lots of investment happening in countries that are big adversarial threats to the United States. So what are the things that we're going to do? And I think that there will potentially be some linkage in the things that we learned from Defend AI that we can somewhat apply to Counter AI. But I will also say we're not going to talk about all of that publicly, right? Because there has to be some OPSEC involved in this as we start to learn and figure out what we're going to do. There's going to be things we're going to share in forums like this, and there's going to be stuff we're not going to share in forums like this, because we're not going to go tell our adversaries exactly how we're going to counter what they're doing. But I do think that those two can be linked.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question.
Okay.
If you don't have a requirement, what do you use for a target?
If you don't have a requirement.
So I don't know that I entirely understand it. I'll tell you the problem we ran into. Like I said, with Titan, we had very vague requirements. And I think across the board, we're seeing more and more requirements come in for AI, and working with Army Futures Command, the community is getting more dialed in. The problem from a PM perspective becomes, I need to program that 5 years out. And so there was some discomfort. We did it with Army Intel Data Platform. We did it with Titan. We put wedges in the prom, significant wedges, against very vague requirements. And then we went and defended it with G8, and they were super uncomfortable. We went to the Hill, to multiple Intel and appropriations committees, and said, hey, we're going to be doing some AI stuff. Here it is in our R form. 4 years from now, I could not tell you what that is because I don't know what the threat's going to be 4 years from now. So it's kind of a culture change and just getting comfortable being uncomfortable, just knowing that we will have a requirement in the future. And we got to put resources against it now because we palm things 5 years in advance.
Yeah.
So definitely a culture shift.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I think you can really apply that across the board digital, right? I mean,
Sure.
AI probably more elusive because it's new and we really, really don't know. But the Army, I think, is doing a great job of quickly adapting how we think and our processes to enable us to really have that flexibility across the digital space, software development everywhere. So, okay. All right, well, I think our time's up, so thank you so much, Chris and Dan, for joining me up here. And real quick, we do have a panel at 2:15 that I will be moderating, another AI panel with industry. So we're gonna have Microsoft, LMI, Anthropic AI, and Anduril, where we're gonna talk about what's coming next for AI. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you all for joining us. The next session in this ballroom will be a keynote presentation from Brigadier General John Cogbill from the 18th Airborne Corps beginning at 1:15.